Hey guys, what's up? It's Carl Walkinshaw here with a video for you to kick off a series of videos that I'll be making in April on issues relating to masculinity, issues relating to manhood. And we're going to kick off this one with the myth of the lone wolf. That's what we're going to be talking about today, the myth of the lone wolf. And you know, I see this in myself, I see this in a lot of guys, which is why I want to make the video. And this is the issue that a lot of guys, when they're trying to make a transition or a change in their life, will just try and do it on the basis of their own resource and try and do it on their own. Yeah, they won't seek help specifically from other guys. I see guys seek help from women. I see guys seek help on the internet, you know, looking up stuff. But essentially, they're not seeking help from other guys. And it really is costly in the longer term. And I'll tell you why. There's an old African proverb, and the proverb goes like this. The proverb is, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. And I like this proverb because it reminds me that actually a lot of the tasks that I'm trying to do in my life, a lot of the ways in which I'm trying to accelerate my life, whether it's earning more money, whether it's in my physical fitness or well-being, whether it's in terms of my relationships, whether in terms of my overall health, a lot of those things are long-term gigs. And the trouble is we don't invest enough time and energy in making the connections in our life that are going to make the difference longer term. And as a result, we stay stagnant and we stay stuck. And there's a reason for this. There's a reason for this, and it's not particularly your fault. And the reason for this is because when we grew up as kids, the role models that we had were essentially ones that perpetuated the myth of the lone wolf. Now, beyond your immediate family, let's say you were lucky enough to have a dad around. When I was growing up, in my life, you know, my dad wasn't around because he died when I was very young, when I was 3 years old. So I grew up without a male role model in my life, largely. Most of my school friends did as well. About half of my school friends didn't have a dad around. And even if they did have a dad around, he wasn't much good. He was drinking too much, or he was hitting on them, or he had issues of his own, or he was out working all hours of the day, or he just was disconnected from himself. And so he didn't really connect with his kids. So whatever your situation is, if you were lucky enough to have a male role model around that was worth his salt, then good for you. And I'm sure that made a positive difference in your life. But for lots of us growing up, where did we go for our role models? Well, we went to our movies. You know, we would watch black and white movies back in the day when there was only 4 channels on TV and you had BBC Two. And what were the movies you saw in the 1950s? It would be John Wayne. And what did John Wayne do? Well, John Wayne would mosey into town, you know, the Duke, and he would mete out justice, and he might have kind of superficial relationships with a couple of people. Maybe he'd even get involved with the local, I don't know, bar girl or whatever. But then he'd mosey on out again. Once he'd meted out justice and sorted out that town, he would move on to the next one. And off he went into the West. And then if you move through the 1960s, well, what happened then? Well, you had the era of James Bond. And what about James Bond? He's like the lone wolf archetype. He's out on his own. He's behind enemy lines. He can't trust anyone. The only person he can trust is himself. Even his other spies that are supposed to be on his side let him down. They double cross him. Even the women he gets involved with let him down. He can trust no one but himself. And so he's another one of these archetypes that perpetuates, conditioned us to believe that we had to do things on our own. If you move into the 1970s, the story's the same. Dirty Harry, Clint Eastwood, one of the biggest icons of the 1970s. And what did he do? He meted out justice in the police department. Well, he was called Dirty Harry, but he really wasn't the dirty one, was he? All the other cops were dirty. But Dirty Harry had to do it on his own. In fact, he didn't like anyone either. He actively disconnected himself from people to live alone, to live a life of a loner, because he thought and believed that he was the only one that could be trusted. And then when you move into the 80s and you have the Mel Gibson movies and you have you have the cop movies of the 1980s, and maybe with the Martin Riggs in some of those Lethal Weapon films, you began to see him trying to build some connections. But essentially he begins those movies alone, suicidal, in a caravan with a dog on a beach. And so we filled our minds as we watched all this stuff growing up with the idea that we were essentially alone, that we had to fall back on ourselves. And so men now, when they're in crisis, don't seek help. Men, when they kill themselves these days, the statistic is that 2/3 of guys that kill themselves never try and access any kind of mental health service whatsoever. Why? Because they're trying to figure it out on their own. From the smallest issues we have to the biggest issues we have, we try and figure it out on our own. We don't seek the deep connection with other guys that could help us. But it never used to be this way. If you look at native cultures, they had rituals and initiation ceremonies which would connect them with a group of men. When they moved from boyhood to manhood, it would connect them with a group of guys that could assist them and help them and had their back. In native Indian culture, for instance, there were, well, let's talk about 2 examples of rites of passage for guys back from our way back from our ancestors. These guys had wisdom we never had, we haven't seen in modern society. Let me give you 2 examples. So native Indian culture, to prove their masculinity, the boys would be cast out. When they got to a certain age, about 12, 13, 14, they would be cast out into the wilderness to survive on their own for 2 or 3 days. They would have enough water to drink, but they would not be given food. And the idea was that during their ordeal in the wilderness, they would come to encounter a wild beast of nature, whether that was an adult bear or whether that was an adult eagle or some other male natural beast would visit them. And in this unspoken exchange between this beast and this boy, wisdom would be exchanged. Whether that boy had to run and hide, whether that boy had to fight, whether that boy had to steal food, wisdom would be exchanged as the bear and the eagle or some other beast or in that wilderness would come to that boy and say, all right, you want to be a man? Well, I am a male. What do you want to learn? And the Indians believed that that wisdom was unique to that boy, and the boy would bring that back into the community. When he returned from the wilderness, he would be changed in some way by the fact that he had this encounter. And he would essentially have become a man because he had this encounter with this wild beast. So this was Indian culture that taught the boy how to get in touch with his inner masculinity, his inner resilience, his inner maleness, and therefore express that in some way in this encounter with the beast. And then the second story I want to tell you is from a book called Turtles All the Way Down by John Grinder and Judith Delosier. And they encountered a tribe in Africa that had a ritual rites of passage ceremony that went like this. When the boys got to age 12, 13 or 14 years old, they would be taken from the village, from their mothers, from the womb that they were so comfortable in, from the community of boys that they were playing with, and they would have to go through a ritual which went like this. They've got a tree, and this tree would be bowed. They would bend this tree over and hold this tree down so that it was taut and had tension. And if you let go of this tree, it would catapult up. And what they would do is they would take these boys and they would sit the boys on the tree so that the tree was taut. And if one of the boys jumped off the tree would throw the other boys through the air, 20 foot through the air. But if all the boys jumped off and one boy stayed on, that boy would be hurled even further through the air. And so through the process of trial and error, the boys had to work out at what point they could balance on the tree so it was taut, and at what time they could leap off the tree safely. And only when they had passed this test would they be initiated into manhood. Now, this test had wisdom within it because this test was about working together. Not a kind of, well, we need to work together, let's tell you a little story about how we work together. No, they had to physically embody the idea of working together. Otherwise, there was damage. There were consequences to not working together, to not seeking each other's help, to not having leaders, to not being part of a group. There were physical consequences if you didn't hold the perimeter. There were battles to be fought, and those battles had to be fought together. So the message of this video is that whilst we in the West have been brought up with a bunch of lone wolf archetypes, and we might go out into the world and try and lone wolf it, actually our ancient ancestors had far much more wisdom than we did. And the wisdom of the rites of passage and the wisdom of becoming a man was actually about connecting with as many men as deeply as possible as you could. So you could go out and walk in nature and connect with other guys. You could sit around in a circle and talk about the issues that were coming up for you. And these groups now are beginning to still exist in the West, but you have to seek them out. If you stay at a superficial level with the guys around you, then we still are acting as if we are boys. We never become men. We still compete with each other. We still play with each other. We still go out drinking with each other, but we don't connect deeply to other men in order to go far in our lives. So that's the message of this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, like the video, share it. I'll see you again for another video in April.